the Parti Québécois was getting reports from all sides that the federal government was lining up immigrants and processing them into its naturalization citizenship process machine by the hundreds. So the Parti Québécois MNAs were very upset by that and said, we can't let this happen. They're going to steal the referendum away from us. And they began talking on strategies to counteract that. And one of the strategies was to propose in the meeting was to disrupt the voting process in the ridings we knew would be heavily voting on the no side. And how was that to be done? Well, it was proposed at that meeting that unions be brought in because they had a great deal of experience in that kind of thing. And it did happen.
Personally, I was hoping it wouldn't go through, and I mean, it couldn't have been any closer. What a strange and momentous result. The history of being written was lost by 1% was almost unbelievable. What a result.
The night of the defeat of the 1995 referendum, then Premier of Quebec, Jacques Parizeau, gave an infamous speech. Parizeau deliberately pointed at the money, the ethnics, and anyone who was not a French Quebecer as the reason for the referendum loss. Yes, it is true that we have been defeated. Basically by what? By money and the ethnic vote. So all that it means is next time, instead of being 60 or 61% vote in favor, we will be 63 or 64% and it will go through. Jacques Parizeau.
Because on the night of the referendum, what did Parizeau do? He pointed at the immigrants, the ethnic vote, and money. So it just didn't appear out of thin air. It was there.
But when Parizeau stood up and pointed a finger, and he talked about ethnics and money, what went over the head of a lot of people is that he actually identified the ethnics. He talked about Mount Royal riding as the area where 96%, I believe was the number, of people voted in one direction, voted no. And that's where he pointed his finger. And for anyone in Canada who doesn't know, or who don't know, about Mount Royal riding, is predominantly Jewish. He was pointing at the Jewish community, not just the ethnic communities, not just the Anglo communities.
After the yes defeat, reports were coming in that during the referendum, the Bloc Quebecois, the official opposition in the federal government, sent faxes out to the Canadian Armed Forces asking members of the army to join the new Republic of Quebec in the event of a yes victory.
Yes, in the few days before the referendum on October 30th, 1995, the Bloc Quebecois caused to be sent to every Canadian military installation in Quebec and some overseas, as far away as Yugoslavia we've been able to establish, inviting members of the Canadian Army to become members of the Quebec Army the day after a yes vote. So it's one indication among many that Jacques Parizeau and Bernard Landry and Lucien Bouchard and company were going to declare independence unilaterally, the Constitution be damned. And attempts to have it reviewed by a committee of Parliament were shut down by the Chrétien Liberals. They deliberately shut down an attempt to investigate the circumstances surrounding the issuance of this fax to the military. as contempt of Parliament. But what happened was, when I tried to have proceedings in Montreal and in Ottawa, because all the facts was sent from Ottawa, I was able to prove it was received in Montreal. So I filed a complaint in both places, and in Ottawa, the justice of the peace said nothing but a job offer. Nothing but a job offer. No problem. Well, I think Louis Mackenzie, who was the general in charge of peacekeeping in Yugoslavia, said that in any other country in the world, they would all either be shot or in jail.
After a razor-thin win by the no side in the Quebec referendum, and the refusal by the media, the politicians, and the elite to take a tougher stand on independence, the Equality Party and the Special Committee for Canadian Unity took matters in their own hands and organized a meeting at the Mcgill Moot Court to lobby the federal government on adopting tougher policies on future referendums on separation.
We wrote the Prime Minister, Jacques Chrétien, take it to the Supreme Court. And you know what his answer was? No. This is a political matter. This is not a legal matter. And he refused. And we put on a meeting at the Moot Court in McGill. We thought that was the right place. This is a legal matter. What we said was, basically, all the arguments that we were making in the '94 election campaign that we never got to make because they took us out of the debate, all the arguments that we were trying to make during the referendum campaign, which we never got to make because they refused to allow us to participate, we're just going to make them ourselves now. Maybe now people are going to start to listen. They're going to realize that this is valid. So we put on our own meeting, and we thought, what do we get? We'll get 300 people, maybe 400 at the Moot Court, and it turned out that we had thousands, literally, but there was no room. We had to set up little televisions in other rooms. Then another room filled up, and another room filled up.
The meeting was to discuss this very issue of constitutionality, and the point that was going to be put forward was that Quebec doesn't have the right to secede simply on the strength of a referendum. But if Canada is to be divided, Quebec will be divided. If Canada is divisible, Quebec is divisible. So then the meeting was held. There were at least 1,200 people who came out, 1,200 to 1,500. It had to be moved into another hall, or rather there were two halls, because so many people came. And it was broadcast live. Now, I spoke in French only, because it was the French audience I wanted to reach with this message. And there was Guy Bertrand, there was Max and Monique Nemny, who were both university professors, PhDs. There was Andrew Coyne, a columnist. I believe Diane Francis was there. We sent this message. We were treated afterwards with the utmost contempt by everybody who is anybody in Quebec.
I remember speaking to Parizeau when I was doing those studies, and asking him, to do a study on the integrity of Quebec's territory, and he said he didn't want to go into that. I felt it was necessary to answer that question. It should have been one of the studies to show to Quebec what would happen in the case of sovereignty. And he himself already knew, he told me so, that challenges would occur, and that some of them might be found valid by the courts.
The story is, of course, that while returning from a meeting in India, Jacques Chrétien, Prime Minister, one of those jet lag nights, couldn't sleep, was sort of channel surfing on TV, saw because it was televised, and saw the response, an enormous response. And dating from that Moot Court meeting was the change in the attitude of the federal government.
Clear majority is important in, the Parti Québécois' position has always been, it's 50+1. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Because it's not just a quantitative result you're after, it's also a qualitative result. What you're after is a result that is such that it cannot be challenged. If it's 51% and there's no way you can challenge that 50 to 51%, then that is it. But if it's questionable, then you need a far greater majority. Sometimes you may need a 65 to 35 majority.
In 1996, after consistent lobbying at the grassroots level by the Equality Party, Guy Bertrand, and other organizations, the federal government finally decided on bringing the matter of the legality of separation to the Supreme Court of Canada.
That what the federal government decided to do was basically what we had been arguing all along. A, put this whole issue of unilateral declaration of independence in front of the Supreme Court of our country. And they did. B, make the issues, frame the issues properly. Is 50% plus one enough? Did it require a constitutional amendment? I.e., do other Canadians have a right to say something about the future of their country, yes or no? And very important, what about the borders of the province of Quebec? These were the three key issues that were put in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. The justices met. Remember, it takes time. They didn't come to their decision. It was put in front of them in '96. That process began, referring to the Supreme Court. They didn't make their decision until August of 1998. Okay, so that took 2 years.
April 18th, 1996, then unknown advertising man Howard Galganov took to the streets and organized a monstrous rally and boycott outside the Fairview Mall. The reason for the rally was lack of English signs and respect in the mall. The mall was located on the western tip of the city of Montreal in an area that was predominantly English-speaking. This was the first of many mega counter-revolution rallies led by civil rights activist and president of the Quebec Political Action Committee, Howard Galganov.
We're in Fairview, having lunch at the food court. And I said, "Do you notice, Manfred, there's not an English sign in this whole shopping center? Fairview is one of Quebec's premium shopping centers. It's huge." And I would guess, certainly at that time, in 1995, 85% of the West Island was English. And most of the people at Fairview spoke English, except there wasn't one English sign in the entire shopping center. She said, "Well, let's stop talking. We've talked enough. Everyone's talked enough. Let's close down this son of a bitch shopping center. Let's show these merchants that we're not second-class citizens. They're going to have to show us respect, and we're going to shut this place down. And we're going to call for a rally and a boycott and a protest, and we're going to surround the shopping center, and we're going to do a number on them." But it was more than that. People were so fed up, and they were so in need of a champion. They needed somebody to stand up for them and say, "Screw you." They needed somebody to stand up and say, "I'm equal. I don't have to be second class. I don't have to be invisible." That's all they needed. Bingo. They were turning people away, if you remember. If there wasn't 10,000 people there wasn't one. It was massive, as anyone who was there can attest. And that sent the first shockwave through ethnocentric Quebec. Fairview changed the entire debate in Quebec. It also woke up the rest of Canada and much of the world to what was happening in the province of Quebec.
Remember, the United Nations Committee on Human Rights met and criticized Canada and said, you cannot take away people's right to commercial freedom of expression. Very important decision. What it said was, you think commercial freedom of expression, because it's billboards and advertising and signs outside a store, that's any different from writing a poem? It isn't. That's what they said. Commercial freedom of expression is the equivalent of any other type of freedom of expression. It's all equal in terms of protection. That's one thing they said. And the other thing they said was, Canada, you cannot subject one form of expression to different rules from other forms of expression. So that means, that's what they said, you cannot do that, it's not proper. You cannot have, in other words, laws that make one language twice as big as the other. or twice as numerous, which is what the Supreme Court has in effect said is okay. It isn't. And that decision, that fundamental decision, which is the sort of gold standard of international human rights, not enough people were told by our media about it. Not enough people realize that what the rest of the world does. In other words, no one else in the Western world does what Canada has permitted the government of Quebec to do on this front. The reason why it's so deeply disturbing is because if you can do it with one right, you can do it with others.
June 9th, 1996, another gigantic rally organized and paid for by Howard Galganov. The rally took place on the Canadian Parlement Hill in Ottawa, and the rally's goal was to send a message to all the politicians about rights and having an equal place for everyone within Canada, including those who lived within the province of Quebec. Attendance 16,000.
I decided that the fight for ethnocentric nationalism or against ethnocentric nationalism in Quebec wasn't in Quebec City, and it wasn't in Montreal. It was in Ottawa. Ottawa had the right at any given time to disavow all of the language laws of Quebec. Ottawa had the right to step in and to save the day and to make Canada truly an inclusive society where everyone would be equal and visible. Ottawa didn't do it. Ottawa is far more the problem than they are the solution. They always have been. So we took the fight to Parliament Hill, and we rented school buses, and we sent hundreds of buses to Parliament Hill. It was incredible. There were over 16,000 people. What I did was I stood on Parliament Hill and I demanded that the Prime Minister defend the rights of all Canadians, no matter where they live. And we were so ignored by all the politicians. They were scared like little field mice.
You have no idea how it makes me feel to see so many people here today. It's not the politicians who are going to save Canada, it's you.